Tokyo in early 1945 was a city unlike any other major capital in the world. While London and Berlin were built of stone, steel, and concrete, Tokyo was still a metropolis of wood, bamboo, and paper. Narrow alleys wound between tightly packed homes. Markets, workshops, tea houses, and family dwellings stood shoulder to shoulder, forming vast neighborhoods where a single match could race across rooftops faster than anyone could outrun it. For centuries, Japanese architecture had relied on wooden frames and thin interior partitions. The design was elegant, flexible, and perfectly suited to earthquakes, but catastrophically vulnerable to fire. And by 1945, Tokyo had become one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Over 6 million people were crammed into districts where houses often touched each other, leaving almost no natural fire breaks. The winter of 1944 to 45 made things worse. Fuel shortages forced citizens to burn scraps of wood, straw, and charcoal. Many homes dried out like kindling. Entire neighborhoods became tinderboxes waiting for a spark, and that spark would soon come from above. American reconnaissance pilots had studied Tokyo's layout with growing fascination and grim calculation. The city's eastern districts, especially the Shitamachi area, were filled with wooden two-story homes, workshops, and factories supporting Japan's war machine. From the air, these neighborhoods appeared as a tightly woven mat of wooden structures. To U.S. planners, it looked less like an urban center and more like a forest that could burn. Even Japanese civilians at the time understood their vulnerability. Government pamphlets warned families to store water buckets and sand near their doors, but such measures were hopeless against mass incendiary attacks. Few realized that the deadliest air raid in human history, deadlier than Hiroshima, deadlier than Nagasaki, would soon engulf their city. By March 1945, Tokyo had already endured scattered bombings, but the scale had been limited. Residents had grown accustomed to nighttime sirens and the distant thrum of engines. Most assumed the worst danger came from high-explosive bombs aimed at factories or military assets. No one in Tokyo yet imagined a firestorm, a living, breathing monster made of flame, wind, and heat that could swallow entire districts. No one imagined that within weeks the ancient wooden capital would become the epicenter of the most lethal single night of destruction in the Second World War. The stage was set. The city was dry, overcrowded, flammable, a perfect storm of vulnerability. All it needed now was the ignition. The transformation of the air war over Japan began with one man, Major General Curtis LeMay. At just 38 years old, he was already known as a relentless, uncompromising tactician. He had reshaped the bombing campaign in Europe. And now in late 1944, he arrived in the Pacific to assume command of the 21st Bomber Command. What he saw frustrated him immediately. The B-29 Super Fortress, America's most advanced bomber, had been designed for high-altitude precision attacks. In theory, it could strike enemy factories from 30,000 feet, using the famous Norden bomb sight with surgical accuracy. In practice, reality was far less elegant. Japan's fierce jet streams, with winds reaching 200 miles per hour, blew bombs miles off course. Missions aimed at aircraft plants instead destroyed rice paddies. LeMay read the after-action reports and felt a rising anger. America's most expensive weapon was failing in its primary purpose. But LeMay wasn't a theorist. He was a problem solver. He studied Japanese cities, analyzed their materials, examined fire patterns, and came to a chilling conclusion. Japan's war production was not concentrated in massive factories like Germany's. It was scattered among tens of thousands of small workshops tucked inside civilian neighborhoods. Destroying Tokyo's industry meant destroying entire districts. The solution he proposed was radical. Instead of high-altitude precision bombing, LeMay would push the B-29 crews into low-altitude night missions. Instead of heavy explosives, they would carry almost nothing but incendiaries. Napalm-filled M69 bomblets that had been tested on American-built mock Japanese villages in Utah. These weapons didn't just start fires, they created infernos. And then came the most controversial decision of all. LeMay ordered the B-29s stripped of their defensive machine guns and armor, reducing weight so each bomber could carry the maximum load of incendiaries. Crews who had relied on guns for survival would now fly almost unprotected into one of the most heavily defended cities in the world. To LeMay, the logic was ruthless, but simple. Tokyo could not be precisely bombed, but it could be burned. Fire doesn't need accuracy. Fire spreads. Fire finds weakness. Fire does not miss within his staff. Some officers were horrified. Others believed the war demanded such brutality. LeMay voiced his justification in equally blunt terms. Japan's cities were built to burn, and burning them would shorten the war, sparing American lives that would otherwise be lost in a ground invasion. By early March 1945, the plan was ready. Hundreds of B-29s would descend on Tokyo at extremely low altitudes, flying in darkness, guided only by radar and intuition. They would drop thousands of incendiary clusters and turn the city into a furnace. Whether one viewed LeMay as a visionary or a war criminal, one fact was undeniable. The firestorm of March 9th to 10th, 1945, was engineered by his hand. Before the night Tokyo turned into a furnace, the weapon that would ignite it had already been perfected. It was small, ugly, and deceptively simple. The M69 incendiary bomblet. Individually, each bomblet weighed just over 6 pounds. But when dropped by the thousands, they were the most lethal fire-starting devices ever designed. The M69 was built around a cloth-wrapped cylinder filled with jellied gasoline, napalm, a sticky gel designed to cling to whatever it touched. At the front end sat a tiny fuse with a magnesium igniter. When the bomb struck a rooftop or street, the fuse snapped, triggering a half-second delay before the magnesium burned through the casing. Then the napalm burst out in a violent spray, throwing burning gel up to 100 feet. Wooden beams, tatami floors, bamboo walls, all ignited instantly. But the M69's real genius was in how it was delivered. The Americans packed 38 of these bomblets inside a single metal cylinder, known as the E-46 cluster. When the cluster case fell about 2,000 feet from the ground, it burst open, scattering the M69s over a huge area. One B-29 could blanket several city blocks in seconds. Barnes-Wallace created the bouncing bomb. The Manhattan Project built the atom bomb, but the engineers who produced the M69 accomplished something far more chilling. A weapon tuned specifically to the vulnerabilities of wooden Japanese cities. Tests in Utah had proven its power. The U.S. military had constructed full-scale replicas of Japanese neighborhoods, complete with paper screens, straw mats, and wooden frames. When the incendiaries were tested, the structures didn't just catch fire, they came apart. Flames raced along rafters, leapt between roofs, and consumed entire houses in minutes. The Japanese fire brigades, already strained by wartime shortages, were helpless against such a weapon. Their hoses reached too few streets, their water pressure was too low, their equipment was designed for single-building fires, not flaming rain falling from the sky. And the M69 was only one part of the arsenal. Mixed in with the main clusters were M47 incendiaries, filled with deadly white phosphorus, magnesium-based bombs, burning at temperatures high enough to melt metals, high explosive charges designed to shatter roofs and walls, allowing napalm to reach deeper into homes. When all these elements were combined, the effect was devastatingly predictable. Small fires everywhere, merging into giant ones, merging into a firestorm. By March 1945, millions of M69s had been loaded onto Pacific airfields. Hundreds of B-29s sat ready, each carrying over 7 tons of incendiaries. Everything was prepared for the greatest incendiary attack in human history. The weapon was waiting. The city was ready to burn. On the evening of March 9, 1945, the runways of the Mariana Islands glowed under rows of dim artillery lamps. Hundreds of ground crewmen moved between the enormous silver shapes of B-29 superfortresses, their silhouettes rising like steel giants against the Pacific twilight. The humidity was thick. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and volcanic dust. For many of the airmen preparing for takeoff, this night would be the most dangerous of their lives. The order was simple, but terrifying. 334 B-29s would take off in waves and head for Tokyo, stripped of guns, stripped of armor, and loaded to the maximum with incendiaries. The crews knew what that meant. If enemy fighters intercepted them, they would be nearly defenseless. If flak hit their fuel tanks, the aircraft could ignite instantly. But General LeMay demanded speed, altitude control, and precision. Light aircraft could fly lower, move faster, and deliver more. Fire engineers had spent the day removing machine guns, ammunition belts, and armor plates. Some gunners stared at their empty turrets, unable to shake the feeling that they were climbing into death traps. Others accepted the logic. Firebombing required weight. Every pound saved meant another incendiary cluster. By 5:30 p.m., briefing tents were packed. Maps of Tokyo covered entire walls. Officers pointed out the target, the heavily populated eastern districts, miles of wooden houses packed tightly together. The objective was not a single factory or rail yard, it was the city itself. Pilots memorized low-altitude flight paths. Navigators practiced radar readings in case the coastline was obscured. Radio operators checked emergency frequencies. Flight engineers reviewed engine temperatures and fuel mixtures. The long flight to Tokyo would push the B-29's massive Wright duplex Cyclone engines to their limits. Outside, crews climbed into their bombers one by one. Some men carried rabbit's feet, family photographs, or folded letters they hoped to deliver after the war. Others carried nothing except the gear on their backs. The interiors of the B-29s were dim and cramped, filled with the scent of canvas and grease. In the bomb bays, rows upon rows of incendiary clusters waited in metal racks, each one capable of starting dozens of fires. At 7 p.m., the first engine roared to life. A deep vibrating thunder rolled across the airfield as propellers tore through the humid night. Ground crews stepped back, shielding their faces from the hurricane of dust. Then the second engine, the third, the fourth. The superfortress trembled as if straining to leap into the air. By 7:45 p.m., The sky above the Marianas was filled with red, green, and white taxi lights. One bomber after another accelerated down the runway, lifting into the darkness. Their glowing exhausts drifted like comet tails. The roaring sound became a continuous wall of thunder, hundreds of planes heading toward Japan. The gamble was immense. Fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, descend low over enemy territory, and drop incendiaries over one of the world's largest cities, all while relying on speed, darkness, and sheer numbers. As the last formations departed, a silent understanding passed among the crews. Tonight would change the war. Tonight, Tokyo would burn. As the B-29 formations crossed the black expanse of the Pacific, the mood inside each aircraft shifted. Conversation faded. Crewmen tightened their harnesses, adjusted oxygen masks, and checked gauges illuminated by faint red lamps. Outside, the world was nothing but stars and darkness, broken only by the distant glow of engine exhausts from other bombers flying in loose formation. The approach to Tokyo required a maneuver no American bomber force had attempted on this scale. Descending from safe altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet to just 5,000 feet, and eventually as low as 1,500 to 2,000 feet over enemy territory. At such altitudes, a bomber was vulnerable to everything: flak, fighters, searchlights, even misjudged terrain. But speed and surprise depended on it. General LeMay's logic was brutal. The lower they flew, the tighter the incendiary pattern, the greater the firestorm. By 11 p.m., the coastline of Honshu began to appear on radar screens. The radar operators watched the green arc sharpen into the outline of Tokyo Bay. Pilots throttled back, beginning their gradual descent. The B-29s shook violently as they entered turbulent coastal air. Some planes hit sudden downdrafts that dropped them hundreds of feet in seconds. Others struggled to maintain proper formation in total darkness. At low altitude, the cold thinned. The interior of the bombers, normally freezing, grew hot from the engine's radiant heat. Crewmen removed gloves. Then jackets, sweat ran down faces as they worked in cramped metal compartments surrounded by thousands of pounds of napalm bombs. Below them, Japan slept. Tokyo appeared at first as a dim, sprawling void. Wartime blackouts had plunged the city into darkness. Only faint reflections from rivers and canals revealed its immense size. Then, through breaks in the haze, the B-29 crews saw their first unmistakable landmark: the snaking ribbon of the Sumida River, cutting through the heart of the city. Navigators confirmed their coordinates. They had reached the target. Suddenly, the first bursts of anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground. Black puffs flashed near the bombers, followed by vibrations as shrapnel rattled against fuselages. The crews braced themselves. Some aircraft flew so low they could see muzzle flashes from Japanese gunners. But the defenders were overwhelmed. Tokyo's anti-aircraft network had been designed to counter high-altitude raids, not hundreds of bombers approaching at treetop level. Many guns could not depress their barrels low enough to track the incoming formations. The pilots pushed on. No evasive maneuvers, no climb, steady and straight toward the drop point. In the darkness, B-29s passed close enough to one another that crewmen could see silhouettes in neighboring aircraft. Inside the cockpits, tension mixed with eerie calm, they had reached Tokyo. The city lay beneath them, silent and unaware. In minutes, the incendiaries would fall. And in minutes, Tokyo would ignite. At 12:08 a.m., the first B-29s crossed over eastern Tokyo. The pilots opened their bomb bay doors and cold night air rushed through the aircraft. Below them lay the working-class district of Shitamachi, a maze of wooden homes, factories, and narrow streets. Nearly 1 million people live shoulder to shoulder there, most of them asleep. Major Harold Howell, George leading the first wave, gave the order, "Bombs away." The first clusters fell silently at first, small dark shapes tumbling toward the city. Then, at around 1,500 feet above the rooftops, the E-46 casings burst open with dozens of tiny flashes. Dozens became hundreds. The M69 bomblets scattered like glowing seeds, each one trailing a ribbon of fire as it ignited. They struck rooftops, gardens, alleys, wooden balconies. A split second later, the magnesium igniters flashed white, and streams of napalm burst out in liquid arcs that clung to walls and floors. Within moments, hundreds of small fires sprang up across the district. Residents awoke to the sound of something that did not resemble bombs. It was more like thousands of objects crashing onto their roofs. A woman stepped outside and saw fire dripping down her walls like molten paint. A factory apprentice ran into the street only to find flames crawling across the ground, climbing the legs of bicycles, carts, and clotheslines. The first wave of bombers continued forward, releasing more incendiaries block after block. The fires joined each other faster than anyone could react. Flames leapt between houses, ignited tatami mats, burst through windows, and raced up wooden beams. The smell of burning oil, pine, and cloth filled the air. Air raid sirens began to howl. But for many residents, it was already too late. Shitamachi's fire brigades, brave but hopelessly under-equipped, rushed to the scene with hand pumps and low-pressure hoses. They were swallowed immediately by the spreading inferno. Water evaporated before it touched the flames. From above, the B-29 crews watched the effect unfold with stunned silence. What had begun as scattered pinpricks of fire now formed glowing lines, then glowing fields. One bombardier later described it as watching a city catch fire like dry grass. The wind was rising. That was the factor no one could see, but everyone would soon feel. The flames responded instantly, bending, stretching, and feeding on the oxygen that the breeze delivered. As the second and third waves of bombers approached, Shitamachi was no longer a target. It was becoming a torch, and Tokyo had only just begun to burn. The fires that began as scattered sparks quickly grew into something far more powerful, something alive. By 12:30 a.m., the converging flames over eastern Tokyo created a rising column of superheated air. As the hot air climbed, cooler air rushed in at terrifying speed to replace it, feeding the flames like oxygen through a bellows. This was the birth of a firestorm. Within minutes, winds inside the burning districts reached gusts of 60 to 100 miles per hour. Entire streets became wind tunnels of flame, pulling debris, clothing, roof tiles. Even people toward the inferno. Survivors later described the sound as a monstrous roaring, like 1,000 freight trains passing at once. The temperature climbed beyond imagination. In some areas, the firestorm reached 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt aluminum and cause asphalt to bubble. Wooden homes that had stood for generations vanished within seconds, collapsing into piles of glowing embers. Families tried to escape, but the wind worked against them. It pulled them backward, making each step feel like walking against a hurricane of fire. Parents carried children through streets where burning debris fell from above like volcanic ash. Some people wrapped themselves in wet blankets, but the heat dried them instantly and set them ablaze. The canals and rivers that flowed through Tokyo, usually a refuge during fires, became deadly traps. Thousands fled toward the Sumida River, believing the water would save them. But the firestorm sucked oxygen from the shoreline, creating pockets of superheated air that boiled the water's surface. When people leapt in, many drowned or were scalded alive. Bodies piled along the banks, illuminated by the reflection of the flames. Animals panicked. Horses tore free from stables. Charging wildly through burning alleys, dogs ran in circles, howling until smoke overtook them. The firestorm consumed everything: wood, metal, rubber, cloth, flesh. From above, B-29 crews witnessed a sight that would stay with them forever. Flames climbed thousands of feet into the sky, forming swirling pillars of fire that twisted like tornadoes. The rising heat pushed some bombers upward even without engine power, lifting them on columns of thermal pressure. Pilots felt their aircraft jolt as if grabbed by an invisible hand. Tokyo, a city of millions, had transformed into a single continuous furnace. One pilot later said, "It looked as if the city was being cooked from the inside out." For the people below, there was no time to think, only to run, crawl, or pray. Streets became rivers of fire. Air became poison. The night became a living hell from which few would escape unscarred. And still more bombers were coming. For the men flying above Tokyo, the firestorm unfolding below was unlike anything they had ever seen. Even veterans of raids on Hamburg and Dresden later said that Tokyo was different: brighter, hotter, more violent, and terrifyingly alive. From 5,000 feet up, the first thing the B-29 crews noticed was the color. The city glowed not orange, but white-hot, like metal in a forge. Flames didn't flicker. They pulsed, rising and falling as if breathing. Massive columns of fire twisted into spiral shapes. Tornadoes born of heat and wind. Some climbed thousands of feet into the night sky, swirling like molten pillars. The crews flew past clouds of smoke so dense they resembled storm fronts. Yet the smoke was not the deep gray of industrial fire. It was bright, illuminated from within. Navigators reported turbulence so violent that instruments jumped and needles vibrated. The heat rising from the city created powerful updrafts that lifted bombers suddenly, without warning. A pilot from the 314th Bomb Wing described the shock. "We cut the throttle, and the airplane kept climbing. The fire below was lifting us like an elevator." The radioman listened to chaotic chatter across the airwaves. Warnings about flak bursts, mid-air collisions, and emergency descents through fiery updrafts. Some aircraft suffered engine overheating as the firestorm superheated the air around them. Others struggled to maintain altitude while flying through thermals strong enough to shake the plane like a toy. Below, the firestorm was so bright that crews could see small details: burning bridges glowing like red threads across the black rivers, roofs collapsing in waves as fire rolled over them, clusters of people moving through the streets as tiny flickering dots. They watched as entire blocks vanished beneath expanding clouds of sparks. Some airmen later admitted they looked away. The destruction was too overwhelming. Bombardiers who normally focused on precision sights found themselves staring downward in disbelief, helpless to change the scene. On one bomber, a tail gunner, now without guns, pressed his face to the glass and whispered that the city looked like a volcanic crater. The analogy spread among the crew. Tokyo did not look bombed. It looked as if it had erupted, And yet not all reactions were horror. Some crewmen felt grim satisfaction. They had lost friends to Japanese fire. They knew an invasion of the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. To them, the inferno below was the terrible price of victory. Others felt only numbness, the emotional shutdown that accompanies witnessing something too vast and too destructive to fully grasp. As the bombers made their turn toward the Pacific, leaving the burning capital behind, many men glanced back through their windows. What they saw was a horizon glowing red, pulsing like a dying star. Tokyo was still burning, and the night was far from over. For the people of Tokyo, the firestorm did not begin with flames. It began with sound, a low, rising roar like the breath of a giant, a wind that grew hotter by the second, sparks drifting through the air long before the flames reached their streets. And then, suddenly, the world ignited. In the eastern districts, the firestorm moved faster than any human could run. The napalm clusters had fallen in overlapping patterns, each canister bursting into flaming jelly that clung to wood, tatami mats, clothing, and skin. Entire rows of houses caught fire in seconds. Residents trying to escape found that the fire outran them, leaping streets and consuming blocks with terrifying speed. Eyewitnesses described the heat as unbearable, hot enough to blister skin from dozens of meters away. One survivor remembered turning a corner and feeling his eyebrows burn away instantly. Another described the sensation of breathing fire as the superheated air scorched lungs. People collapsed without being touched by flame, simply overcome by the furnace-like temperatures. As the firestorm intensified, it created its own weather. Winds up to 100 miles per hour tore through the streets, pulling debris, roof tiles, and even people into the flames. The oxygen was sucked upward toward the rising columns of fire. Those still alive found themselves dragged toward the center of the inferno by winds strong enough to knock adults off their feet. Tokyo's rivers became both refuge and trap. Thousands ran toward the Sumida River, believing the water would save them. But the heat above the surface was so intense that many drowned while trying to keep their faces underwater. To avoid burning, wooden boats caught fire. Bridges collapsed. The river itself boiled in places. Firefighters and police tried to maintain order, but their equipment had been designed for normal peacetime blazes. Not a citywide hurricane of fire. Hoses burst from the heat. Engines were swallowed by flames. Firemen attempting rescues were thrown into the air by heat gusts or suffocated when the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. Neighborhoods that had existed for centuries vanished in a single hour. One firefighter later recalled seeing a mother shielding her child inside a small ditch. Both had been overcome by heat, preserved in the same position as the fire passed over them. Another survivor described running with a wet towel over her head, only for the towel to burst into flame before she reached the next street. And yet, amidst the chaos, acts of extraordinary courage emerged. Families linked hands to push through smoke-choked alleys. Neighbors carried elderly residents on their backs. Volunteers guided children toward the river, even as the firestorm closed in behind them. But the tragedy was unavoidable. The firestorm consumed 16 square miles of the city. More than 100,000 civilians died, many within minutes, making it the deadliest single air raid in human history. For those who survived, dawn on March 10th revealed a landscape that no longer resembled a city. It looked like the surface of the moon, only still hot, still smoking, and still echoing with the memories of a night that defied imagination. When dawn broke over Tokyo on March 10th, 1945, the sun rose over a city that no longer existed. The firestorm had burned itself out, leaving behind a silent landscape of smoldering ashes. Smoke drifted upward in thin gray columns, carrying the smell of burned wood, oil, and human life. The sky was hazy, tinted red by the heat that still radiated from the ruins. The eastern districts, once home to nearly 1 million people, had been reduced to an expanse of charred debris stretching to the horizon. Streets that had once teemed with vendors, bicycles, and families were replaced by twisted metal, collapsed beams, and rows of blackened foundations. Telephone poles stood like skeletons. Brick walls, the only structures that resisted the flames, remained as lonely, jagged fragments. Survivors wandered through the ruins in shock. Many were barefoot, covered in soot, their clothing burned away or reduced to rags. Some searched for family members, others simply walked without direction, unable to process the scale of destruction. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant cries of injured civilians trapped in collapsed shelters. Emergency workers arrived to find scenes beyond comprehension. Bodies lay along riverbanks, in canals, in the foundations of homes. Many were frozen in final gestures, shielding children, holding hands, or curled in positions of instinctive protection. The intense heat had left many unrecognizable. Rescue teams used wooden carts to carry the remains, but soon there were too many to count. Tokyo's authorities, overwhelmed, were forced to dig mass cremation trenches. Smoke from these fires mixed with the haze left by the bombing, creating a suffocating atmosphere that lingered for days. Priests walked among survivors offering prayers. Volunteers distributed rice balls and water from makeshift relief stations. Hospitals overflowed with burns, smoke inhalation cases, and injuries from collapsing buildings. The physical damage was so vast that Allied analysts later concluded the raid had destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, more than the destruction caused by the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Over 100,000 people had died in a single night, and more than 1 million were left homeless. Yet for Japan's military leadership, the raid carried an even deeper psychological impact. The imperial government had long believed that the capital was safe from catastrophic attack, that Tokyo's size, spacing, and firefighting system would prevent large-scale devastation. The March 10th raid shattered that illusion. It demonstrated that the U.S. could reduce Japan's cities to ashes without ever landing a soldier on the home islands. For the United States, the raid marked a pivotal moment. Major General Curtis LeMay concluded that low-altitude, nighttime incendiary attacks were the most efficient method to break Japan's industrial capacity and civilian morale. In the months that followed, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities were subjected to similar firebombing missions. By the summer of 1945, 1/5 of Japan's urban area had been burned to the ground. And yet, even amid this devastation, Japanese civilians displayed remarkable resilience. Families built small shelters out of the ruins. Neighborhood groups organized food distribution, tended to the injured, and reconstructed makeshift homes. Despite everything, Tokyo refused to die. But history would remember March 9th to 10th, 1945, as the night fire outkilled the atom, the deadliest air raid in human history. A night when the winds of war turned Tokyo into a furnace, and the world saw the terrible cost of total war on a modern city.